Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Project Esther, the U.S. conservative playbook to silence solidarity with Palestine.
What this is really trying to do, in other words, is effectively kind of like poison the pro-Palestine movement.
From deportations to defunding universities, parts of the plan are already in motion. What might come next? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
My name is Tariq Kenney-Shawa, and I'm a U.S. policy fellow at Al-Shabaka and a producer at AJ+. And I'm calling in now from New York.
Very cool. We're so happy to have you here on The Take. And so we're going to be talking about Project Esther today. Project Esther was first made public in October of last year. And at that time, it was still sort of this abstract plan from the Heritage Foundation, which, if people don't know, is a conservative think tank. Project Esther was framed as a way to fight anti-Semitism and to keep Jews safe. So, Tariq, let's start right there. What did they say that they were trying to do, and what was the strategy that they were pitching?
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, there's an obvious difference between what Project Esther's architects say they're trying to do and then what Project Esther actually is. So, I mean, as you just mentioned, Project Esther is an initiative that basically claims to be a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism in the U.S. Mm-hmm. But if you take a closer look at it, what Project Esther actually is, it's effectively a blueprint to dismantle or even destroy the pro-Palestine solidarity movement in the U.S., under the pretext of combating anti-Semitism. And so the architects of Project Esther, basically, they aim to do this by conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and accusing both, the individuals and the organizations that advocate for Palestinians and Palestinian rights of being Hamas affiliated. And that's part of what the Heritage Foundation calls the quote unquote Hamas Support Network, HSN.
Hamas Support Network is what they call it. I mean, is that a real thing?
No, it's not a real thing, obviously, but it's the case that the Heritage Foundation is trying to make on both a narrative level, in terms of, just American public opinion, and a legal level, with the ultimate goal of making support for Palestinians and criticism of Israel just toxic or outright illegal. There's a wide variety of legal tools that the Project Esther proposes using against the Palestine solidarity movement. And that can range from RICO prosecutions, anti-racketeering prosecutions, to FARA investigations, to accusing organizations and individuals within this movement of providing, quote unquote, material support to foreign terrorist organizations, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or, the Iranian government, for example. And the thing about material support laws, and I'm not a lawyer, but the point of them is that because they have been historically so vague, this gives the federal government the leeway to define whatever it wants as material support to a foreign terrorist organization. And so basically what Project Esther, in that it was published on October 7th, which is a year after, marking the year anniversary of October 7th, 2023. This was before Trump was elected, but basically what Project Esther and what Project Esther's architects at the Heritage Foundation argued was that, this is the legal blueprint that we want to have ready for when we have a friendly administration in office that is willing to use this legal toolbox against these organizations. And that's what they got with the Trump administration.
And Tariq, they also seem to be very focused on universities, right?
Yeah, I mean, universities and the student movement is absolutely their primary focus. And I want to tie this back to the fact that, like we mentioned earlier, this is primarily focused on the narrative battle, right? The public opinion battle. Because in the US, we've seen a quite rapid shift in American public opinion around Israel, growing support for Palestinians, growing criticism of Israel that has only really skyrocketed during this 18, 19-month-long genocide in Gaza. And 53% of Americans now hold unfavorable views of Israel. And that is the highest number in polling history. And that's extremely significant considering just how historically pro-Israel Americans have been. But while this change is absolutely, across the political spectrum, it's obviously a lot more acute in the left and among young Americans. That's why there's such an overwhelming focus on universities and college campuses.
I also think it's very important to mention, because some people may be less aware of the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther, but they might have heard of Project 2025, which has gotten a lot of attention in the media. And that is also something, a blueprint written by the Heritage Foundation. This was like a 900-page manual that, is meant to consolidate power in the federal government and the executive branch, sort of re-engineer American society, opposes reproductive rights, opposes immigrant rights, has sort of drastic effects on American society. And Heritage Foundation also wrote that plan. These are the architects of also Project Esther. So I think it's important to mention that. Now, also, Tariq, so neither the White House or the Heritage Foundation has confirmed that Project Esther is official White House policy, right? But we've been seeing these crackdowns on universities, attempted deportations.
This morning, the Trump administration is targeting a half-dozen international students as part of a crackdown on pro-Palestinian campus activism.
Tonight, a dramatic escalation in the Trump administration's ongoing battle with Harvard. The Department of Homeland Security telling the university it can no longer enroll foreign students, and existing foreign students must transfer or lose their legal status.
What else is in this plan that hasn't been rolled out yet that we might see in the future?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more of an extensive campaign to link Palestinian advocacy explicitly to terrorism, to use material support laws to accuse these pro-Palestine organizations of somehow providing support to Hamas or being led or directed by Hamas.
The president has signed an executive order promising action against international college students and others who took part in pro-Palestine protests during Israel's war in Gaza. His aggressive action aims to revoke visas of foreign students and prosecute offenders found to be Hamas sympathizers.
And Tariq, when you talk about, so they're maybe wanting to criminalize certain forms of protest or advocacy, saying that that's like material support for terrorism. Could you conjure up like an example for me of what that might look like?
For example, like Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a university group that advocates for Palestinian rights. What we might see is that the federal government might accuse Students for Justice in Palestine of providing quote unquote material support to Hamas because of their student protesters who are going out on campuses and protesting in support of, an end to the genocide. And so what we might see is that the federal government might make the case that because students are going out and using their free speech rights to protest for Palestinian rights and using their free speech rights to protest for an end to the genocide, they are somehow providing material support to Hamas, which might sound absurd to us, but because material support laws are inherently written to be so broad, that gives the government so much leeway in what they can define as material support to a foreign terrorist organization. I think we're also going to see increased state-level laws penalizing boycotts of Israel and attempting to criminalize pro-Palestinian advocacy at the state level. And then I think we're also going to see the intensified use of RICO, anti-racketeering prosecutions, and FARA investigations. So this is like a multi-pronged effort that I think we're going to start to see more of over the coming months.
Wow. And the goal of this would be to silence speech, right? Like this would be to chill any sort of efforts at pro-Palestinian advocacy. And when you mentioned RICO, I mean, RICO is, gives prosecutors the opportunity to go after not just individuals, but like a criminal network, right? How would that apply in this case?
Yeah, so all it takes really is accusing one or two organizations of providing material support to terrorism. And that creates kind of a domino effect because then other organizations won't be able to interact with these organizations over their own, reputational concerns and legal concerns. So what this is really trying to do, in other words, is effectively kind of like poison the pro-Palestine movement.
Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah.
it bears mentioning that RICO, the government used RICO in order to shut down the mafia. So the fact that they're even approaching it with this sort of mindset that
Yeah.
Palestinian protesters are sort of mafia that needs to be stamped out
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
pretty alarming.
And it really ties into this narrative they're trying to set, that the movement is kind of this highly organized network that is top down, but following orders from external actors like Hamas and Iran, which is just
Right.
not true.
More with Tariq after the break. So last week, the New York Times published reporting that fills in a lot of gaps about Project Esther, how it came together, and who the architects of the plan are. So Tariq, who are these people?
Yeah, so that's where it gets particularly interesting, because Project Esther is designed and led not by Jews or Jewish, primarily by Jews or Jewish organizations, but by conservatives and the far right and evangelical Christians, who provide kind of like the backbone to, again, the Heritage Foundation, which is America's largest conservative think tank, and has been historically very, very influential in shaping far right policies and narratives. And like you mentioned before, Project Esther does emerge kind of as a component or an outgrowth of Project 2025, which is that, sweeping conservative authoritarian blueprint for Trump's second term. Of course, the current administration is not going to be like, yes, we are taking this, and that point from Project Esther and implementing it. But so many of the advisors that surround that orbit around Trump, are deeply involved in both Project Esther and just the Heritage Foundation. And I think, with that in mind, it's really important to recognize that, this initiative, despite the fact that they're claiming it is to combat anti-Semitism, is primarily spearheaded by evangelical Christians who are using this as an opportunity to create a blueprint of repression that they can then use against the wider efforts to oppose either the Trump administration or his allied conservative agenda.
I am always sort of fascinated by this link between the Christian nationalists and Israel. Maybe you could remind us very briefly, what is Christian nationalists' interest in a Jewish state?
Christian Zionists basically believe that support for Israel fulfills biblical prophecies necessary for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so with that in mind, a lot of evangelicals support Israel not really out of a genuine solidarity with the Jewish people, but because of these theological and political beliefs that kind of tie their faith and Israel's political interests directly to the existence and the continued strength of Israel. And I think it's important to recognize that evangelical Christians have long been a very, very powerful voting bloc in the U.S. They've long had a very influential role in shaping the Republican Party, and that's why they've been such a useful ally for Israel for decades. It's not just a new development.
That's interesting. So it's not just a theological thing. There's also a political component
Absolutely.
to it.
Yeah, there's a political component, there's an ideological component that really ties the far right, creates an affinity between the far right and Israel. I mean, the far right, Israel kind of symbolizes to the far right this defense against Islam and Arab nationalism, and they really align with each other on when it comes to far-right anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant sentiments. And then Israel also serves as like a very convenient symbol of Western strength and colonial-style dominance in the Middle East. And that alone is really embraced by a lot of far-right groups. And that kind of allows Israel to frame itself as the defender against terrorism, against Muslims, and within this wider ideological struggle that is important even here in the U.S.
Fascinating. So Tariq, this tactic of labeling criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic in the U.S., as we were saying, it's not new, right? Zionists and their allies have been doing this for decades. Now, you've written about how Project Esther fits into this long bipartisan effort to silence pro-Palestinian advocacy. How does it fit into that history, and how does it take things further?
Yeah, I like to see Project Esther very much as an unprecedented escalation of this history. One of the first examples of this are the very, vague counterterrorism laws since 1969, for example, the Foreign Assistance Act, which which kind of like ties in back to like the UNRWA debate. And it says that, no U.S. aid can support people who are involved in terrorist activities and focus on Palestinians overwhelmingly. And so what we saw, in the post 9/11 era, that kind of, that expanded these tactics, leveraging the material support laws, which again are intentionally vague. And, we saw the increased surveillance powers that disproportionately targeted Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinian activists. But then more recently, we've seen since 2014, dozens of states adopting the anti-boycott legislations, making boycotts of Israel illegal in direct response to growing popularity around the BDS campaign. And these efforts, on both the federal and state level have been really spearheaded by both Republicans and Democrats alike to make criticism and boycott of Israel effectively illegal and impossible in the US. And that has always been a bipartisan effort. But what's happening now is that, because Republicans and because, the conservatives at the Heritage Foundation are aware of this bipartisan history of pro-Palestinian repression, that's why they're using it as kind of an entryway or a first step in something that in a strategy that they're going to try to apply to the national level.
So one of the goals of Project Esther, as you mentioned, is to kill the narrative that Israel has lost the argument in the court of public opinion. But opinion polls definitely make it look that way. You mentioned the polling earlier on, and one of the architects of the plan, Victoria Coates, told the New York Times that it's, quote, reassuring for Israelis to hear that the largest conservative think tank in the United States is on the case. How does any of that actually help Israel's image? It kind of feels like the battle has already been lost.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I don't think this is going to help Israel's case at all, because, what Americans are seeing is they're increasingly tying Israel to this authoritarian crackdown. And, in a recent poll, I'm forgetting who it was, but the huge majority of Americans actually oppose the Trump administration's effort to deport pro-Palestine activists. And what this is doing is basically, in the eyes and the minds of Americans, they are now tying Israel to this authoritarian crackdown. And that doesn't help Israel at all. That makes Israel look real bad.
Well, and interesting, in researching this story, I learned, I was looking into even just the name Esther, right? And I learned that Esther is the name of an important biblical figure in the Old Testament. She was a queen who thwarted a plot to kill Jews in the Persian Empire. So invoking her name, calling this whole project, Project Esther, it really implies like they're going to be saving the Jews, right?
Yeah.
Tariq, given everything that we know and everything that you've just been sort of spelling out, do you think that this project actually makes people safer?
No, I think it makes the entire country less safe, and it makes Jewish people less safe. Again, because it's fueling anti-Semitic tropes that Jews are the ones behind the scenes, pulling the strings, getting people arrested, stifling free speech, and that's just gonna backfire severely, and it's just going to make Jewish people less safe, and especially considering the fact that they're using combating anti-Semitism as the pretext for all of this.
It's kind of a crazy thing. This country has a long history of protest, of war, protesting against wars. And now those wars are being, protesting war is being linked to being a terrorist. So that's what this is all about. So Tariq, I kind of want to now wrap up and ask you, what does resistance look like here? Is there a playbook that we can use to push back against a campaign, a coordinated campaign like this one?
I think one of the most important things we need to be doing right now is basically intersectional coalition building. Palestine solidarity activists, we have to build broad alliances with folks in the racial justice movement, environmental movements, indigenous rights movements, and civil liberty groups, because that type of solidarity prevents the isolation and the fragmentation that Project Esther's architects really are kind of counting on to kind of achieve what we discussed earlier in terms of picking off individuals and organizations, isolating us from each other, and creating an environment where our work is toxic. And then I think it's also a matter of exposing this agenda, strategic framing, right? Really making it clear that what Project Esther is trying to do is more than an overreach. It's trying to take away our constitutional free speech rights as Americans. And that is a unifying factor. That is a unifying argument that gets a lot of Americans on board. So there's a lot of things we can work on that will not save us from this crackdown, but will at least provide a level of insulation and a community that will push back against this in the long term. And most importantly, build a movement that will outlast the Trump administration, because the Trump administration isn't going to last forever.
Well, Tariq, I want to thank you so much for all your reporting and on Project Esther and for coming on The Take.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
We reached out to the Heritage Foundation for comment. They didn't get back to us, but their employees told the New York Times that they didn't know if the White House had used Project Esther as a guide. Robert Greenway, a Heritage National Security Director and one of the plan's co-authors, said it was, quote, no coincidence that we called for a series of actions to take place privately and publicly, and they are now happening. And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this one, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all of our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so that you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.